gang. How about a Fender Mustang bass in competition finery? This is the older cousin to the Music Master bass I worked on back in January. It's quite similar in most respects. The Mustang again has the short 30-inch scale aimed at younger players or beginners. And it was introduced in 1966. It was actually the last product that Leo Fender had a hand in designing while he was still at the company, before he sold it. This version, the Competition Series, has the fancy racing stripes. These were introduced in 1969. This example's from 72. Stylistically, it's a nod to race cars, right? They sort of supercharge your instrument and turn it into a high-performance Shelby Cobra. Of course, in those days, you could walk into a bar in California and find yourself in a winner-takes-all race for pinks as you rode your bass across the nation with Dennis Wilson as your mechanic and co-pilot. These competition ones are quite desirable and in some cases can bring more than the older mid-60s basses of the same model, which is something that doesn't happen very often in the Fender world. This is the blue version, but for some reason it's called Competition Burgundy. If your French restaurant serves you a wine that looks like this, don't drink it. It is aged into kind of an almost green tone, sort of turquoisey. Very nice. Doesn't need very much. It's got some sticky tuners again, and a jack that is sometimes intermittent if you wobble it. We'll see. Neck relief is around 9/1000ths. I think I'll leave it there, as the owner has a fairly aggressive attack. Could probably use just a little bit more bend in the neck. For certain other players I might straighten it. Oh yeah, players of note. We'll go homegrown this time with Chris Murphy of Sloan, who's had the same candy apple red Mustang since, gosh, it's got to be 1991. That's like 33 years. Wow. We'll plug in and see if we can get the noise to happen. It's pretty normal. It might be a little bit loose. We'll see. Pretty snug. Let's look inside. Very familiar. That's a replacement volume pot from 2014. Everything else looks original. We'll clean the jack and spray some cleaner in the pots as well. We'll spray some of the contact cleaner inside, available at any place that deals with auto parts. We'll just rotate the knob back and forth to clean up a little wiper. The jack isn't loose, the wire is still solid. It's a little bit dirty. Give it a bit of a clean here. You'll note that there's only one wire going to it, which is kind of confusing, but you got to realize the metal plate that it's attached to acts as the ground, because the housing here, the whole case, is actually grounded by it. And if you were to put another wire to it, you might end up with extraneous grounding noise called a ground loop. Now that's good and springy. I don't think there's a reason to change that jack. I'll clean up the barrel with some of this gray Scotch-Brite pad. I'll just twist that through there. Make sure there's good contact and that it's not full of oxidation or anything. That looks good and clean. One of these screws is not like the others. It's too clean and shiny. Remember to sweep the floor of your shop before you take something like this apart. You don't want to end up with one chrome screw and two nickel. Oh well. Yeah, these tuners, there's a bit of lag in them, quite a lot of friction. And the one on the end here, the actual knob portion, if we can call it that, or a leaf, is bent slightly in one direction because it obviously took a hit at some point. I'm looking at this and there are marks on both sides that look like a pair of pliers gripped it and tried to bend it back. Do I want to try that myself? There's only so many times you can try it, right? And sometimes we just live with that little bit of a bend. I don't want to be the guy who breaks it. Well, let's give it a shot. Yeah, and you know, if you don't have soft jaw pliers, maybe wrap several pieces of tape around it or something to pat it a bit. And these things, of course, I think we ran into this, maybe it was a jazz bass or something last year, where these things are held, basically squashed between two tabs on the post, and if they get loose, they can vibrate with certain frequencies in a very distracting way, so you have to be careful. That seems solid, but I'm not really affecting much change, unfortunately. I think it's probably going to have to stay that way. And one of these tuners is not like the other. It's got a much larger washer and a flathead screw on this one. The others show fairly significant wear in the Phillips portion of the head. And one of these tuners is not like the other. It's got a much larger washer here and a flathead screw versus the Phillips here, which have quite a bit of wear in them. I want to point something out. On the shafts here you see this line, this build-up, which could have been white lithium grease, but which actually has a feel to me like it's actually white diamond polishing compound. Someone may have tried to clean up the guitar at some point. If you get that stuff down in here, you're going to create a whole bunch of little score marks, basically like piston scoring, going back to our automotive analogy, which is going to cause a lot more friction than you want between these parts. So again, you can use white lithium grease is fine, or just straight paste wax, just a little bit. You don't need a whole lot against the bushing inside there, and that will keep things moving freely. Alright, so we're set up to the customer's preference in terms of action. Got a fresh set of round wounds on here. I think I like short scale basses. I didn't know this about myself. But yeah, if I was going to play a bass, which I'm not, but if I was, I might go for a short scale bass like this. They're fun. And now for something different. You know, every once in a while, people will comment on the music that starts off my videos, that bouncy little song, and they'll want to know where it's from and if tabs are available. Well, that was composed for me by my friend and sometimes client, Sean Trotter. He calls it Ted's Tune for some reason, I don't know why. But Sean has now got a YouTube channel, Guitar Centric, and he's decided to make a tutorial to teach people how to play it, because he's got enough requests at this point that, okay, we should do this. And he's also come up with music and tabs available in PDF for download. So if that's interesting to you, you should bop on over to his channel. I'll leave a link probably somewhere up beside my head here. And also one down in the video description. The other thing is, I'm back on the merch train. Yeah. Some of you will recall that I was having difficulty with the previous printer and drop shipping company I was working with. People were waiting inordinate lengths of time to get their stuff. So I've got a new one with a different website called Bonfire that will now be printing shirts, including a new design. Yes, the new design. Some of you saw a preview of this on Instagram. I'll tell the story again. A long time ago now, I encountered a vacuum tube in original packaging from the 1940s made by Raytheon. People who listen to Behind the Bastards are chuckling right now. I really like the design, that sloped logo, the mix of sans serif and script lettering. It was very satisfying to me on an aesthetic level. Anyway, Raytheon started making things other than amplifier tubes over the years. These are valves for you people in the UK. They became a huge, one of the largest US military contractors, making missiles and stuff. A tremendous amount of tax dollars goes into their coffers. And being a YouTuber, I have to pay American taxes. 20% of which go right into the complex, Well, I did some digging and I discovered that they'd let this trademark lapse back in the mid-90s. And in fact, last year they rebranded the whole company to a more cuddly sounding acronym, because at this point, Raytheon does sound like something out of a James Bond film. So I'm like, you know what? They're not using it anymore. I'm going to take inspiration. I had to hand draw this thing because, well, that's how they were originally done, this kind of lettering. And I couldn't find a font that was close enough to allow me to manipulate into something that looked right. So this is old school pen and ink, which I then scanned and put the colors on, etc. And I got stickers. The merch company I'm using now doesn't print stickers. And to be honest, the old one, I think I was making something like 7 cents per unit or something. So I'm going to try something crazy and actually mail these out myself. I know, that's asking for trouble, but I made a little card to accompany them. So there are only 2 ways to get one of these. First is you can send me $5 on PayPal. That's pretty much the only transaction app that works cross-border. So I know you USians want to use Venmo or Cash App. It won't work, so it's got to be PayPal. When you do that, there's a little field in which you can put your name and your address. Be accurate, right? Because I'm going to have to cut and paste that to make the label that will go on the envelope that will be used to ship this to you. So you can do that, and I'll put it in the mail for you. The other way you can get one is to sign up for my Patreon, which I finally activated and made public. Props to the one gentleman in Germany who actually found it and subscribed before I told anyone, even before my wife. I don't know if I should worry about that or not, but thank you anyway, sir. Realize this is going to be a serious assembly line process for me, stuffing and addressing envelopes. Don't complicate the process, please. Oh, I know it's forbidden to get all political and stuff, but $1 from the proceeds of these will be going to a Canadian-based charity which is working to provide medical aid to kids in Palestine, when that's allowed. I figure this is probably the best way I can counteract some of those tax dollars of mine that went into producing ordnance to drop on the heads of civilians. And maybe there's one single oud maker in Gaza, a man called Hamad Atwa, who, a fantastic story, against all odds. He was in a refugee camp, got the calling. He wanted to build instruments, found a way to do it, despite being unable to import any woods because of the blockade. But I hope he's okay. No idea. So if that offends you, then don't get a sticker, and don't bother to tell me, because I don't want to hear it. Now, I'm picking up work on the mid-60s Gretch 6119, the Tennessean. This thing has had multiple rounds of lacquer sprayed on it, followed by leveling of the finish. And it actually continues to shrink back into dips in the surface despite all that lacquer, especially around the previously plugged extra tuner holes drilled directly in the center of the headstock. Those had been filled with epoxy, and that epoxy may be spongy enough to contract with the lacquer as it shrinks, because I seem to be chasing an uncatchable foe. Remember, this guitar has had 3 separate finishes sprayed on it. There's the original lacquer, which had aged and checked, and parts had fallen away. Then there was an overspray, which completely covered everything, filling some of the checking and the dings, not all of them. And then of course now you got my 7 coats of new lacquer, which I've been sanding back hard to try and level the imperfections. So the actual finish thickness on there is still pretty darn thin, and I have to be careful. These last coats have been left to sit for almost a month, so I do have to level and buff this thing at some point. Why not strip and respray the whole thing? Because the original inlay here is very, very thin. It's like 20 thousandths of an inch, half a millimeter or less, and I don't think it would have survived the process. I'm using 1200 grit wet dry sandpaper, and I like to use it dry for this application. 1200 grit is pretty fine, but I find that it suits my sanding style. So if I try and go heavier, the grits, they usually end up leaving little scratches that are too deep, and they'll show up later when I'm buffing. So the main thing is to use a flat block, not press too hard, and to try and keep the paper clean. I mean, it clogs almost immediately, which, I'm prepared for because I'm going to go through a lot of it. Why not use water and wet sand? Well, on these old guitars with the crispy dry finishes, I don't want any water to infiltrate under the surface, which can happen, even in an overspray situation. And that can cause like white ghosting or even delamination of the finish. So doing this work on repaired surfaces is different from just sanding and buffing a brand new guitar. The flat surfaces are almost never as flat as they are when they're new because they've bowed and they've buckled over the years. And the integrity of the finish, even with an overspray, is more tenuous, So I don't find this a fun job. It takes a long time and it's kind of nerve-wracking. I've got some automotive buffing compound on a foam pad chucked into an electric drill. This all takes a little bit of time. There's no way to rush it. You just kind of go back and forth and wait for the shine to appear. I'll reinstall the bushings. This is a little pushing tool with a padded block that's got a 1/4-20 bolt through it. And this knob comes down and squishes the 2 parts together, seats it nice and firmly and predictably. Then I'll do the tuners. There is, of course, some veneer in the way, so I have to remark and re-drill the holes. They'll end up in the same holes, though. The nut previously seems to have been installed with a whole bunch of JB weld, which isn't great, so I had to spend some time cleaning that out. So it's time to make a new nut. And this is, of course, more of a string guide than it is a height positioning nut, as this guitar has a 0 fret. But it's virtually identical in every respect to the usual kind of nut, except the string slots are going to be a little bit deeper. So this whole sequence parallels very closely the nut I made last week for that Les Paul. If you get into this business, you're going to do a whole lot of nuts. This is probably one of my least favorite bridges to try and restring. Designed to work with the Bigsby. This one has little convex feet on them, and the posts are not particularly snug in the holes. And those feet fit into little radiused recesses in the bridge top. The whole thing, I think, is designed to rock back and forth with motion from the tremolo. So you got the situation where you're trying to keep the string in the Bigsby tailpiece while also keeping this thing fairly upright. It's just a fun time. Okay, we're finally back to looking like a Gretch. Here's a reminder of the starting point, when the guitar appeared to be property of the United States Senate. I think I'm satisfied. Although I don't know whether I should be disappointed, because there are certain areas where some of the checking from the original finish is actually starting to telegraph through again. But I suppose, at a certain point, the 60-year-old guitar is going to 60-year-old guitar. I'm okay with it.